Chapter 7 of The Country Beyond. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Country Beyond by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 7. Peter was on his way to the mystery of the bundle he had found in the jack pines. At the foot of the ridge, where the green plain fought with the blighting edge of the stew kettle, he stood for many minutes before he started eastward. With keen eyes gleaming behind his mop of scraggly face bristles, he critically surveyed both land and air, and then, with the slight limp in his gait which would always remain as a mark of Jed Hawkins' brutality, he trotted deliberately in the direction of the whiskey runner's cabin home. A bitter memory of Jed Hawkins flattened his ears when he came near the rock-cluttered coulee in which he had fought for Nada and had suffered his broken bones, and today, even as he obeyed the instinctive caution to stop and listen, Jed Hawkins himself came out of the mouth of the coulee, bearing a brown jug in one hand and a thick cudgel in the other. His one wicked eye gleamed in the waning sun. His lean and scraggly face was alight with a sinister exultation as he paused for a moment close to the rock behind which Peter was hidden, and Peter's fangs lay bare and his body trembled while the man stood there. Then he moved on, and Peter did not stir, but waited until the jug and the cudgel and the man were out of sight. Low under his breath he was snarling when he went on. Hatred, for a moment, had flamed hot in his soul. Then he turned and buried himself in a clump of balsams that reached out into the plain, and a few moments later came to the edge of a tiny meadow in the heart of them, where a warbler was bursting its throat in evening song. Around the edge of the meadow Peter circled, his feet deep in buttercups and red fireflowers, and crushing softly ripe strawberries that grew in scarlet profusion in the open, until he came to a screen of young jackpines, and through these he quietly and apologetically nosed his way. Then he stood wagging his tail, with Nada sitting on the grass half a dozen steps from him, wiping the strawberry stain from her fingertips. And the stain was on her red lips, and a bit of it against the flush of her cheek, as she gave a little cry of gladness and greeting to Peter. Her eyes flashed beyond him, and every drop of blood in her slim, beautiful little body seemed to be throbbing with an excitement new to Peter as she looked for Jolly Roger. Peter went to her and dropped down, with his head in her lap, and looking up through his bushy eyebrows he saw a livid bruise just under the ripples of her brown hair, where there had been no mark yesterday or the day before. Nada's hands drew him closer, until he was half in her lap, and she bent her face down to him, so that her thick, shining hair fell all about him. Peter loved her hair almost as much as Jolly Roger loved it, and he closed his eyes and drew a deep breath of content as the smothering sweetness of it shut out the sunlight from him. "Peter," she whispered, "I'm almost scared to have him come today. I've promised him. You remember, I promised to tell him if Jed Hawkins struck me again? And he has. He made that mark, and if Jolly Roger knows it, he'll kill him. I've got to lie. Lie." Peter wriggled, to show his interest, and his hard tail thumped the ground. For a space Nada said nothing more, and he could hear and feel the beating of her heart close down against him. Then she raised her head and looked in the direction from which she would first hear Jolly Roger as he came through the young jackpines. Peter, with his eyes half closed in a vast contentment, did not see or sense the change in her today, that her blue eyes were brighter, her cheeks flushed, and in her body a strange and subdued throbbing that had never been there before. Not even to Peter did she whisper her secret, but waited and listened for Jolly Roger, and when at last she heard him and he came through the screen of jackpines, the color in her cheeks was like the stain of strawberries crimsoning her fingertips. In an instant, looking down upon her, Jolly Roger saw what Peter had not discovered, and he stopped in his tracks, his heart thumping like a hammer inside him. Never, even in his dreams, had the girl looked lovelier than she did now, and never had her eyes met his eyes as they met them today, and never had her red lips said as much to him without uttering a word. In the same instant he saw the livid bruise, half hidden under her hair, and then he saw a big bundle behind her, partly screened by a dwarfed banksian. After that his eyes went back to the bruise. "Jed Hawkins didn't do it," said Nada, knowing what was in his mind. "It was Jed's woman, and you can't kill her," she added a little defiantly. Jolly Roger caught the choking throb in her throat, and he knew she was lying. But Nada thrust Peter from her lap and stood up, and she seemed taller and more like a woman than ever before in her life as she faced Jolly Roger there in the tiny open, with violets and buttercups and red strawberries in the soft grass under their feet. And behind them, and very near, a rival to the warbler in the meadow began singing. But Nada did not hear. The color had rushed hot into her cheeks at first, but now it was fading out as swiftly, and her hands trembled, clasped in front of her. But the blue in her eyes was as steady as the blue in the sky as she looked at Jolly Roger. "I'm not going back to Jed Hawkins any more, Mister Roger," she said. A soft breath of wind lifted the tress of hair from her forehead, revealing more clearly the mark of Jed Hawkins' brutality, and Nada saw gathering in Jolly Roger's eyes that cold, steely glitter which always frightened her when it came. His hands clenched, and when she reached out and touched his arm, the flesh of it was as hard as white birch. Even in her fear there was glory in the thought that, at a word from her, he would kill the man who had struck her. Her fingers crept up his arm, timidly, and the blue in her eyes darkened, and there was a pleading tremble in the curve of her lips as she looked straight at him. "I'm not going back," she repeated. Jolly Roger, looking beyond her, saw the significance of the bundle. His eyes met her steady gaze again, and his heart seemed to swell in his chest and choke him. He tried to let his tense muscles relax. He tried to smile. He struggled to bring up the courage which would make possible the confession he had to make. And Peter, sitting on his haunches in a patch of violets, watched them both, wondering what was going to happen between these two. "Where are you going?" Jolly Roger asked. Nada's fingers had crept almost to his shoulder. They were twisting at his flannel shirt nervously, but not for the 10th part of a second did she drop her eyes, and that strange, wonderful something which he saw looking at him so clearly out of her soul brought the truth to Jolly Roger before she had spoken. "I'm going with you and Peter." The low cry that came from Jolly Roger was almost a sob as he stepped back from her. He looked away from her, at Peter. But her pale face, her parted red lips, her wide open, wonderful eyes, her radiant hair stirred by the wind, came between them. She was no longer the little girl, past 17 going on 18. To Jolly Roger she was all that the world held of glorious womanhood. "But you can't," he cried desperately. "I've come to tell you things, Nada. I'm not fit. I'm not what you think I am. I've been living a lie." He hesitated, and then lashed himself on to the truth. "You'll hate me when I tell you, Nada. You think Jed Hawkins is bad, but the law thinks I'm worse. The police want me. They've wanted me for years. That's why I came down here and hid over in Indian Tom's cabin, near where I first met you. I thought they wouldn't find me away down here, but they did. That's why Peter and I moved over to the big rock pile at the end of the ridge. I'm an outlaw. I've done a lot of bad things, in the eyes of the law,